Well, Steve, thank you so much for joining me today on the highest level. And I'm looking forward to talking about the coaching that you're doing now. But I'm fully aware that, like myself, you were also a high level coach previous to entering into the executive coaching and speaking realm. So to start with, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your competitive coaching career before you got into what you do now?
Totally, yeah. Firstly, Evan, appreciate you having me on, man. As we've had the pleasure of you being on my podcast before, which was awesome. But at the same time, I'm just such a fan of what it is you're doing, and super excited to be here. But just a little bit about my background in sport. I come from the sport of swimming, and for me personally, all I pretty much knew from the age of about probably 4 or 5 sport, and slowly but surely the sort of 11 or 12 sports that I played probably around the age of 9 or 10 shrunk down to about 5 or 6. And before I knew it, I was left with the sport of swimming around sort of 16, 17 years old, and really started to invest my life into it. Made my first British senior team when I was 20 years old, I believe. And from that point on, I actually moved over to the US, started swimming in collegiate swimming at North Carolina State University. And then I kind of fell into coaching. And I really mean that in the sense of I finished my swimming career, had shoulder surgery within about a week of finishing my career because my shoulder was hanging on for dear life by the end. And came by the pool and just started kind of helping out. And before I knew it, I noticed that athletes responded to me. There was something about the way I was presenting insight and messages that they just appreciated. I don't know why at the time it was, but I'm sure it had a little bit to do with just my success as an athlete. But at the same time, I think there was something about the way I was communicating that I suddenly realized, hey, this whole coaching thing could be a thing for you if you want to give it a go. And that's how I approached coaching at first. And about 10 years later, I finally made the decision to stop coaching. This was the fall of last year in 2021. But in that 10-year block, I had countless people, meddling within the SEC when I was working at Louisiana State University for most of that 10 years. And some of them went on to the NCAA championships, became All-Americans. And most recently, last summer, I even put an individual on the US Olympic team, which was the first ever in LSU's history to do that. And then about 2 months later, I walked away from some coaching altogether. So explain that.
Well, I'm going to let you explain it, Steve. That's why you're on the podcast today.
That's why I'm here, right?
You made an interesting comment there about the way you were presenting things to athletes that quickly caught on. And just give us a little bit, if you can, like, was it the accent that really caught on? Was it the fact that you were taking complex ideas and making them simple? Just like, what do you remember from that time? And why do you think your messaging got through to athletes so well?
Yeah, I love that question because it's really at the heart of how I coached, not just from the beginning, but throughout. And one of the things that comes natural to me is meeting people where they are. So what I mean by that is if I'm working with a walk-on, if I'm working with an Olympic talent, it's completely irrelevant. To me, I always try to meet them wherever they are in their career in terms of what their expectations are from me in that coaching role at that time. And so when I started working with athletes, let's say when I wasn't even when my title wasn't coach and I just started talking to people, I would always try to sort of sit down and figure out, okay, are they looking for my insight from Steve, the international swimmer, or are they looking for me to relate to them in terms of where they are in their careers right now, and to be a little bit more understanding and very much real with them? Okay, listen, that maybe international swimming isn't going to be in their future. Maybe even successful swimming at the conference level may not even be at their future, but they want to get better. They want to get better. And I need to meet them in that headspace. I need to come to this person and say, okay, wherever your realistic goals may lie, I'm going to coach to that. I'm going to coach to where you are in this moment. And so communicating has always been at the heart of everything that I do. And it made me feel like an outlier, to be honest, at times in the coaching world, specifically swimming, because it's a very science-based world. And I kind of go against the grain in that world, in that regard, and just focus more on the communication relationship side for sure.
Well, really cool that you had that insight early on in your career? Because I know for me personally, like it took me a little bit to gain my authentic coaching voice.
Right.
Oftentimes we're around other, leaders, maybe sometimes even great leaders, and we want to do everything we can to kind of embody the type of leadership that was successful within us without maybe at times being authentic to ourselves or maybe lacking that piece. So really cool that you were able to recognize that just because you've been at a high level and you know what it takes to compete at a high level, not always every athlete is there, either mentally or physically. And like, how do you meet that athlete where they are? I guess I'll just ask quickly to follow up. Like, was that something that was evident in the teachers that you had and the coaches that you had, or was that just kind of like an innate sense that you had for coaching?
It was more innate that it was something I was exposed to. If there was an element in my life where I was exposed to it, I'd have to say it was probably my father. He was a very common sense type of guy, very much just lay it out exactly how it is. And I think being raised that way always allowed me to see situations for exactly what they were. So just to sort of take that one step further from a coaching standpoint, instead of looking at a group of 20 athletes and saying, okay, we're going to go for a national championship. Well, that with that group of athletes, that just simply may not be realistic. And even competing for a conference championship may not even be realistic. So what's the point in delivering a message like that when it's just simply unattainable? So what does it mean then to sort of go one step further and say, okay, this is the situation we're in, and these are the individual situations that we all find ourselves in terms of what we're capable of achieving. And that's where if you meet people in that mind and headspace, then suddenly the element of realism becomes right at the forefront of the conversation, of the communication that you're having. So for me, that always came easy to me. And when I started to look back and think, as I've started to build my business, like when did these seeds of coaching start to be planted for who it is I am and what it is I do? I never necessarily realized it, but in my last 3 or 4 years as an athlete, I was already doing a lot of this. And so that natural transition for me to just coach people in that same headspace, it came pretty easy, to be honest.
Really cool. Because I think like you make a good point about like, I'm sure it's the same in swimming and football. Each year, there's maybe 10 teams that have a realistic chance at winning a championship. That's just kind of like the way it's always played out. And that has to do with recruiting and the type of coaching that's there. And maybe even like the preceding years leading up to that point. And you bring up the fact like, well, what's the point if we're not here to win a national championship? So share with us, Steve, like what is the point in competing if we're not going to win a national championship?
Man, I love that question because it just brings me right to what I believe in most, which is striving to be the optimal self. And for me, that's my everyday, my everything. And that took a long time to get to that headspace because, again, as much as I was pretty good at the one-on-one stuff when I first started coaching, I think I still felt the need to put on a front when I was talking in front of a group, the rah-rah sort of, like, hey, here we go, all this kind of stuff. And I found quite quickly how that can really fall on deaf ears if it's delivered incorrectly. And I needed to figure that part out. That was the part of coaching that did take time, and I did have to figure it out. But in terms of that ability just to simply find value in competing whatever realistic level of competition may be for you, it's about saying to someone like, what is it you want to get out of this? Like, what does the optimal level look like to you? Well, I want to be a national champion. Okay, well, let's talk about that. How realistic is that? And maybe you start to discuss that, hey, maybe that's not as realistic as you thought, but at the same time, what are these elements just beneath that are realistic, that we can work towards, and that are going to force you to show up every single day and present the best version of yourself? Because so many, as fun as it was for me to see an athlete of mine make an Olympic team last year, believe it or not, those aren't the stories that I tell from my coaching career in swimming. The stories that I tell are the walk-on that was told their entire life that they never had a chance, that going to Division I SEC swimming made no sense, they should consider something else. And they became an Olympic trial qualifier, So they became one of 2,000 invitees, for instance, every 4 years they got to go to this competition. They became the fraction they became the fraction of successes in the world of swimming, despite being told that they should never even consider pursuing that in the first place. Those are the stories that I tell. Those are the stories that always get me fired up when I look back on my career.
Yeah. And those are the stories we love. I mean, that's why sports is such a great teacher of life and life lessons. And I completely agree with you. And obviously a lot of alignment between your personal philosophy and your business now and kind of why I started the Highest Level podcast, right? Like the highest level, yes, we want to compete at the highest level. We want to win at the highest level, but the highest level is really about performing at your highest level. And like, what does that mean? And like, you know, we say about always doing our best. Well, your best right now as a freshman swimmer is going to be different than your best as a junior swimmer when you've had a lot of wins and a lot of losses and a lot of lessons that you've learned. And so I love kind of like your philosophy overall. And I think that kind of gets lost nowadays, right? Like it's a very Instagram culture. It's about like what the results are. It's about what you look like. It's about what picks you have at the end. But ultimately, you know, not to get too philosophical here in the first, 10 minutes of our discussion, but like, it is about the journey and it is about kind of like who you become on that journey specific to sports, right? Like, especially when you're talking about swimming in college or playing football in college or really whatever you compete at, like it's so minuscule, the number of people that get the chance to go on to compete professionally or compete at the Olympic level. It's like, well, what is the point? And obviously there is a whole lot more that lies in there other than just, looking good on our Instagram pics or winning a national championship. So I'm glad that you pointed that out. Let's talk a little bit about like, swimming is a world that I'm not all too familiar with. Obviously I come from like a very huge team oriented world in football where you have, anywhere from 60 to 120 players on a team plus staff. Sure. Talk about some of the great swim teams that you've been on and like, what are the commonalities of those swim teams? And is that mirrored in the same maybe intangible traits that you find in the great individual swimmers?
Yeah, when we talk about swim teams, I go back to before I actually came to the US. I was privileged, to say the least, to be a part of a local sort of hub for some of the best British swimmers in the northwest of England at the time. And I was one of only 8 on this team. And the fact of the matter was that we had 5 people in that group of 8 that were really capable of making an Olympic team in the 2003-2004 season for the Athens Games. And then there was one who was very much on the fringes. Maybe they could do it, maybe they couldn't. And then there was myself and another guy that were just going along for the ride. It's just we were 18 years old and we had way too much ground to cover to go from being true Olympic hopefuls. But we were ahead of the typical development of a youth at 18. And so for me, that was just an amazing exposure to, okay, what does it mean to have shared goals that are beyond necessarily the individual? And what I mean by that is, how can I get invested in the work that I put in each and every day, knowing that I have no hope of making this particular Olympic Games in 2004, but knowing that the work that I put in and the way I show up every day influences the guy next to me's ability to make that Olympic team. It was a level of selflessness within a team environment that I just simply didn't know existed in an individual sport like swimming. Because at the end of the day, you stand behind the block and there's no teammate to get you through that race. You are on your own every single stroke. So what does that support system look like on a day-to-day basis in a training environment where the selflessness of every single person that's training their ass off is that they're doing it and they are hurting themselves every day so they can create an environment where someone who does have the realistic aspirations to be successful can feel as though they're in this community. And I use that word community deliberately. It is a communal setting when you have that type of environment because everyone has shared ideals of being successful. And so when I look back at that year in 2003, 2004, all those 5 made the team. One of them got himself an Olympic medal. 3 of them made an Olympic final. So just the success that was actually delivered by that tiny group of 8 as individuals came from the unified approach of the 8. And the best story that I have that came out of that too was the guy that won the bronze medal in his event called me the night that he won the medal. And I'm this 18-year-old kid that really doesn't know a whole lot about the world of international swimming. And he thanked me. He thanked me for the work that I put in to help him get to that point. And that just, it all came full circle in that moment for a guy that was in many ways still naive, still new to what it means to train as a group, as a team in the sport of in an individual sport like swimming. For him to turn around and say thank you for what you brought every day so that I could pursue my goal really just spoke volumes. And it was a lesson that I've never, as you can tell, I've never forgotten and certainly felt the impact of for the rest of my life.
That is a awesome story. I'm getting goosebumps listening to that story because we were just talking about well, what is the point of all of this? And I was talking with a friend the other day and she was mentioning about how important having significance in your life is, right? And it's did you win that bronze medal? No, you don't have the bronze medal to put on your mantle or on your wall, but you were a part of that. And regardless of how small a part of it, in particular, you might have thought that you were, the fact that this person not only understood that you played a role in that success, that personal success, but also went as far as to commend you and personally let you know, says a lot. And I think really when we get to the heart of sports and being a part of any team, to be quite honest, this is what it really comes down to, is having that significance. We talk in football a lot about the we before me culture. And we used to talk all the time as team success as a prerequisite to individual success. Now I understand swimming, wrestling, track, these sports are slightly different because it's an individual performance, strictly individual, that contributes to the team success versus basketball, soccer, football, where it truly is a all-encompassing team effort. But I think it still kind of rings true. That is what I just wrote down as you were kind of describing it, having these shared goals beyond the individual, and that significance is so important. Let me ask you, from your swimming career, how do you promote that type of selflessness on a team? How did you see that done by coaches you worked under, or how have you done it in your own experience?
Yeah, it's easier for me to talk about that actually as a coach myself, because the crazy thing about that story, and I literally was just connecting the dots as I was telling it, was that I had a realization back in the spring of 2021, it's about a year ago now, when I was sitting in a meeting with this kid, Brooks Curry, who went and made the Olympic team for LSU. And as much as he had these hopes and dreams, the one thing I kept saying to him was, you can't do it by yourself. You can't. There has to be a system in place for you to achieve this goal. But if it's just me barking orders at you every single day and there's no one else in sight, you're not going to achieve this goal. You're going to get fed up of me. I'm going to get fed up of you. It's just the way it is. That's what happens when two people just go back and forth all day long, every day. So how do you create a community that's going to give you this opportunity to go and achieve this thing? How do we get a group of maybe 10, 12 people together that can train with the same mindset that you need to train with and create the atmosphere that you need to go on and do this? But most importantly, to your question, where do we start? Where do you start with that? And for me, it's about selling people, again, going back to this version of the optimal self. And it's when I actually created this plan, the first thing I did, because in spring training in college, there's not much you can really demand in the sport of swimming. It's all optional stuff within the NCAA. So the first thing I said was we have someone that wants to do this and that I think some of you realize is capable of achieving this lifetime goal. But who wants to do it with him? And everyone just sort of looked at me. I was like, no, you misunderstood what I asked. I didn't ask who wants to make the Olympic team with him. I just asked who wants to do it with him. Who wants to go through it with him? Who wants to support it with him? Because he can't do it on his own. And I was just open and honest about it. And I just said, I know that he won't have a chance of doing this if he's doing it on his own. So I spoke to the entire team at the time and asked that question. And slowly but surely, in the space of a couple minutes of speaking, hands started to go up, people started to think, people started to reflect. And then I had another meeting for those people that were considering being a part of it. And this was a group of about 16, and that 16 turned into about 14. And then by the time we started this phase of training, it was about 12. So I knew, it's like, we're in, we're doing this, we're training, we're all doing the same stuff every single day. Only one of us has the true possibility of making an Olympic team. Some of you have not only the ability to make the Olympic trials, but maybe perform well when you get there and be competitive. So I was starting from the beginning with just upfront honesty in terms of saying, like, listen, these are the expectations of this training environment that I'm inviting you into. The question is, do you want to be a part of it? And if you do, at least you know before you make that decision what's going to be expected of you. So really emphasizing those expectations and being honestly, brutally honest at the beginning and saying, this is what you're signing up for, kind of take it or leave it.
How you frame that is so great and I think crucial as well. I really believe that you start as you mean to go on.
Right.
And what I mean by that is, like, we can't speak to you one way and then have to de-recruit you once you get on the team or once you're in because we've kind of duped you into being here. Those brutal expectations, those crucial conversations, if you will, are so key. Number one, like you just said, you get the wrong people off the bus because not everybody's down for that. And that's perfectly fine. You don't need all 16 to be in, but you need the 12 that are like down for the journey. But I also love how you kind of were very just like transparent about what it's going to take and that this person cannot do it on their own. And I think this is a common misconception when we're talking specifically about great athletes. Like, we see great individual performers and we think it's just them by themselves alone in a gym or a swimming pool. Or we look at somebody like LeBron James and we think that, like, he just is naturally gifted and he just does it on their own, not realizing that these people have entire teams outside of their own team that support them and provide them. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about unconditional love or support or just like maybe it's like spiritual connection or emotional connection. Like, there are places that are needed for these individual performers that often aren't talked about, but yet are vital. And literally, these individual performers can't succeed at an elite level without this support. And I love how you kind of brought it back to the we before me mentality. You mentioned something else. You mentioned the optimal self. Talk to us a little bit about that. What does that mean?
Yeah, so this has been at the heart of everything I've been doing as I've built my business here in the last 8 months or so. And for me, the best way to describe it is that wherever we are in life right now, we've lived this point of our life with a specific level of expectation for what it is we do each and every day. And sometimes we may allow our minds to wander off to, this is what we're capable of, this is what we can maybe do, this might be my potential, etc. The question is, how big is that gap? How big is that gap between the expectations that you're living your life by now versus what you believe your truest potential is? And how willing are you to insert yourself into that gap and work on that development? Because for me, when I talk about optimal self with clients now, the one thing I get across quickly is that we need to be clearer with where our expectations truthfully are right now of ourselves. And then we need to be more honest as well about what we're capable of, because a lot of the time we're selling ourselves short in both of those areas. So we think the gap's quite small because we think our expectations are higher and that our potential is slightly lower. But the truth is, a lot of the time our expectations are a little bit lower and our potential is a little bit higher. So that gap is bigger, but it's bigger in a very exciting way. And that's how I sort of look at it, as I say, okay, gap's big and that's okay. Because all it means is that we've become a little bit more honest and open about where our expectations truly lie. and we've started to accept that we're capable of just that little bit more. And another way I like to describe the gap as well is just a chip on the shoulder. Is what does that chip on the shoulder look like to you? You know, you and I have had conversations about the best athletes and why these chips on their shoulders have gotten them to where they've gotten to. And it's all well and good, but I actually use the chip on the shoulder as a very positive thing. And I think a lot of the time that's been coined as like a negative, or this person's attitude is the way it is because they got a chip on their shoulder, and it's like a negative thing. And when I present this to clients now, sometimes they do move back in their seat a little bit and they just think, well, what are you trying to say, sort of thing. And I'm just like, no, you're not hearing me right. What I'm saying is that you have this chip on your shoulder that is this potential catalyst for what you can now go on and do. But you've been taught to frame it as this thing that's holding you back, when truly it's actually a catalyst. You just haven't figured out how to best use it yet for it to serve you. And so for me, that's what so much of what I do is about. It's discovery based, but that notion of the gap is probably the best way I like to explain what that journey, at least towards the optimal self, looks like.
Very cool. And this is a great segue. Tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing. We've talked about your competitive coaching career. Talk to us a little bit about your business and kind of the coaching that you're doing now.
Yeah, my business is Career Competitor. It came off the back of my podcast. And what's funny is that the story of my podcast was working with former athletes actually on what it means to take the characteristics that they utilized as successful athletes into what it is they're doing away from sport now. And so that's where my conversations began 4 years ago with the pod. And those conversations turned into me meeting people that were incredibly successful at what they did. And as we started to go back and forth in our conversations, they found that I was able to sort of bring out of them some notions and some thoughts that they didn't anticipate maybe bringing out in the conversation. They thought it was just going to be kind of a surface level interview, and before they knew it, they were revealing a couple of things about themselves that they're just like, okay, yeah, I guess I am capable of this. I guess I am capable of that. And before I knew it, the seeds of my business were being planted. And I really mean before I knew it. I actually had people telling me what I was doing before I myself saw that I was doing it. And before long, I felt that the world of swimming was kind of making me feel a little bit more trapped. I guess the ceiling became really clear to me at one point, and I just thought there's more to life, there's more to this world of coaching, as you've come to find, that is out there, and there's more people to reach, there's more worlds to conquer, so to speak. And so when it comes to what I do now with my clients, it's self looking at a lot of this assumption that I can get to a certain point, and then within a couple of sessions, they start to more. And the one thing I've come to discover real quick is that as human beings, we're super curious about what we're capable of. A lot of the time, people just aren't introducing that line of conversation to people. The truth is, when you present that conversation to someone and they really start to get attached to this idea of curiosity towards what they're capable of, suddenly the light bulbs start to go off. Suddenly these ideas and these notions start to come to the surface that they've just been either ignoring or pushing down for too long. And my demographic is hilariously wide, from 26 to 72 in terms of my client base, which makes no sense in terms of, like, you talk about a niche. I mean, there's no niche there when you're working with people of that age gap. But at the same time, the common part of that is that everyone I work with is curious to see what they're capable of. And coaching to that is about, for me, it's about the most fun you can possibly have.
Yeah. And like you mentioned earlier, like meeting people where they are and kind of like helping take them to that next level, which I always enjoyed about both my football coaching career and beyond. That I'm passionate about intangibles, as does the audience here. So let's talk about just some of the intangibles that you've seen in some of these elite performers you've worked with, and maybe even like some of the coaching clients that you've worked with. What are the intangibles that you kind of notice that stick out most commonly?
The first one is accountability. And I think the thing with accountability that has been wrongly framed for, let's just say, history, is the fact that people need to be held accountable to prove they have accountability. And I believe accountability is such a inner strength, an inner tool that when you have it, when you work with someone, that has it, you see it and you don't have to enforce it. And the beauty of accountability is that those people seek coaching. They seek improvement. They seek advancements. They don't wait to be told. And I think that's if you're someone that can be held accountable, that's great. And that makes you a super useful part of any team, any organization. But the ones that truly stand out when we're talking about high performance as we are, people that have this innate accountability, they go one step further in terms of being held accountable, and they truly seek that information out. And that's what I've already come to realize, even just in this business world, is there is this sort of 80-90% of people that are comfortable being held accountable, but it's the 5-10% that are successful that seek that information, and they have that inner accountability. And that's what separates them as high performers versus the masses.
Yeah, I love this. And this also kind of ties back to how passionate somebody is or how important what they're doing is to them. Mm. I just have found that those people that are very passionate about what they do, whether in sport or outside of sport, have that ability, like you said, to be coachable, to want to get better, to hold themselves accountable, not only to the standards of the team, but more importantly, to like their own high standards, because it matters to them. And I think this is an overlooked piece, especially when we're talking about hiring. Right? Mm-hmm. Like people look at, well, does this person have the skill? Like, well, Steve's great. And like, yeah, I love his energy, but like, he's never used Salesforce. So, I mean, right. Can he really do this job? And especially nowadays, like everybody's been in computers every single day of their life for 20 years. Like teaching them to use Salesforce or whatever program is minuscule, like should not even matter, because like the person that has used Salesforce that you're quote unquote not going to have to train for a week, if they don't have that passion or that drive, you're going to continually being on top of them. That accountability piece almost immediately becomes more important than anything. And I think that's often overlooked in the entire hiring process.
It really is. And the adaptability component too that comes with accountability, in my opinion, if you are someone who is just so innately accountable for what it is you do, you're going to have a heightened sense to what it means to adapt. You're always going to be more aware of it because of this inner standard that you have for yourself. Something I have coined, this sort of term minimum standard that I do with my clients. It's for me, minimum standard is this level that we set for ourselves where we just simply say, this is enough and this isn't enough. Now, the thing is with that is that people hear the term minimum standard and they just say, oh, these are just the minimal requirements of what you got to do to get the job or whatever it might be. And it's like, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that if we are measuring ourselves towards our optimal self, then our minimum standards have to be significantly higher than the average person, And, again, when it comes to that, how aware, how conscious are you of something like that within yourself? And when you start to work and invest on these things inwardly, suddenly that heightened sense to having to adapt, to having to learn, it comes natural, and it should come through in an interview. And it hopefully in time, more and more hiring leaders and etc., they start to see that, listen, if I just look at the resume, I'm already doing a disservice to the person that I'm interviewing. Like the resume should get them in the seat. After that, put the resume to one side and learn, like get to know the person in front of you and see if you can measure and identify some of these heightened senses that they maybe have that go way beyond the resume.
And a completely wasted time for everybody if the resume gets you into the seat only to get in that seat and talk about the resume.
Exactly.
And like this happens so often. Like, tell me about tell me about like your career and like what did you do here? It's like you can read all that on the resume.
Right. It's on the resume. Read it.
it's on the resume. Like we're wasting our time here. Like you should be asking me, what's important to me. Like, why do I think this job is a great fit for myself? Not like what I did 5 years ago when I was a completely different person. Right.
Exactly.
Going back to our earlier point in our conversation. I love the minimum standard. And I was asked on a podcast recently, how did I go from fourth grade football to the NFL in 6
Sure.
years?
Right.
And they were trying to like kind of get me to say like, what was the one like turning point? What was like the huge like watershed moment? And I didn't have one. And I told them, I was like, I had a mentality from the first year I was specifically a college coach, but like even back earlier, it was like my mentality was you're either getting by or you're dominating. So it was like there was only two options every single
Right.
day. I'm either
Right.
showing up here and I'm going to do just enough, or I am going to absolutely blow the lid off of everybody's expectations of me and of myself, and do things better than anybody could have ever imagined them. And like, is that intense? Yes, like, but very much in line with my personality. But I think it's also in line with what you described there as the minimum standard. Like the minimum standard isn't the bare minimum just to get by. The minimum standard is like the minimum standard is to dominate.
Right.
Like, oh, I'm doing photocopies. Yep, gonna dominate. Right. Oh, you're passing out you're passing out Chick-fil-A's as guys get on the bus. Yep, I'm dominating.
Yeah.
Which of course builds the foundation for your future domination as you progress and as you are given more responsibilities. So I love that minimum standard. I think even though different words, like kind of like the exact same as dominating or just getting by.
And it's always so important. Like again, here we are on a show that's about high performance. You know, if this is a world that if we're coming into a world of high performance, then this is what we have to discuss, the minimum standard. You know, if this podcast was called Average Performance, then, you know, firstly, you probably wouldn't have as many people listening, but secondly, at the same time, it's like, it does become about minimum requirements more. It becomes about entry level stuff. It comes about, you know, being part of the masses. And that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about optimal self, high performance, all these sort of things. If we're talking about that, then you have to have these important, you know, sort of North Stars, as I call them, when it comes to the minimum standard. So, you know, hey, this is what I have to operate here. If I don't operate here, then even thinking about high performance doesn't make any sense.
Oh, yes, 100%. And it's not for everybody, right? Like There are some people out there that like they're in roles or they're at a point in their life where that's not a premium to them. And you might be hiring for roles that don't require that. And that's perfectly fine. But as you said, like when we're talking about the high performance business, where we're talking about holding ourselves to these types of standards, like these are the people we are speaking to. These are the people that we coach and that we want to be surrounded by in our personal and professional lives.
Yeah, exactly.
You talked about your podcast. And you said 4 years, which, you know, congratulations on that. That is quite an accomplishment. Just want you to reflect for a minute on maybe some of the guests that you've had. And is there one or two either lessons or guests that stand out to you during that time that maybe either changed the way that you viewed something or taught you something in those interviews?
Yeah, the place I'll identify the most is the phase of that 4 years where so many people started podcasting, which was during COVID. Everyone started to create their own podcast, right? And so I consider myself kind of before the uphill climb of the popularity of podcasts. But at the same time, during that time, I made this decision to start a Women Changing the World series. So I did this 10-part series where I talked to 10 different women about how they've gone from, you know, being maybe part of the minority and shaping something for themselves that can not only set themselves up for success, but be a trailblazer for other women to follow as well. So this was back in 2020. And what it did is it really started to shift my perspective towards the person as opposed to the performer, and how much more we need to be giving that the airtime that's required to learn more about what it means to develop the self, to develop the person, as opposed to just always make it about measuring performance. You know, so for me, I learned through the hardships of a lot of women in terms of how they got to the place where they were able to get to. And two women I actually had on in that 10 episodes, both of them work within Major League Baseball. So you talk about you talk about a world where women just don't, you know, they don't get the opportunity to not only be heard, but even have opportunities to work. Women are now starting to have their voice heard. They're now starting to really be seen. And a lady, Elizabeth Ben, who came on the show, I think she may have even been my first of the 10 episodes. In the past couple of months, she's now been hired full-time in the front office with the New York Mets. And you talk about someone who started out seeing that there weren't people like her in this world, but they wanted to be a part of that world. So how the heck do you define performance in a world where you can't even identify seeing yourself in, right? I mean, that's a whole process that you have to go through before you even try to insert yourself into becoming successful in a world. So that's about the self. That's about, how do I figure myself out? How do I present myself in a way where I can even be seen and heard within this world, where I'll eventually be assessed, where performance will eventually become a thing. And it was just a massive eye opener. It came from very sort of sentimental beginnings, because my daughter had barely even turned 1 by that point. So I became a huge, fan of just women being heard and giving women the chance and the voice that they needed to they deserve to have. And this idea came to me, and I ran with it, and it was just amazing. And the 10 different stories were all completely different. But an example like that, say with Elizabeth Ben, and just women in a place, in a field where they simply don't have representation. There may be people listening to this right now that want to achieve something, that don't see representations of themselves in that field to begin with. So how the heck do you measure performance if you can't even see a version of yourself in that world? So it's all about starting with you, focusing on you, developing you, and then you can start to think about and consider things like performance.
Yeah, 100%. And obviously you do a lot of work with this now, with the work that you're doing, a lot of career coaching in addition to executive coaching. Just share with our audience where we can find you, and any way we can connect with you.
Sure. Real simple, careercompetitor.com. You can find me, all my information there. The website continues to evolve. I don't think it's a finished product, as we've been talking so much about finished products on this episode and getting better. The website still needs to get better. But careercompetitor.com. You can just also go to steve@careercompetitor.com. Just email me. I much prefer that. I'd love to just have that opportunity, 10, 15 minutes of your time just to chat. I love getting to know people. And hey, if you think you've got a story to tell, I've got a platform to tell it in addition to this podcast as well. Obviously, with the podcast Career Competitor, you can go check that out anywhere you listen to podcasts too.
Love it. A great podcast. And we are all continuing to improve. Nobody here is a finished product. So
absolutely.
We can all acknowledge that, whether we're talking about our website or our own personal development. So Steve, great conversation today. Thank you so much for joining me here on The Highest Level.
Evan, I appreciate you, man. Thanks for having me.